Settle down, we'll start shortly. Please. Okay. You can start now. Start. I call to order the high-level event for the closing of the 2019 International Year of Indigenous Languages. In accordance with the customs of the indigenous peoples and in recognition of the peoples of these lands, we will now hear a traditional welcome by Chief Tadod Daho, Sidney Hill of the Onondaga Nation.
This to us he has given, the one who is our creator. This the way, our way to do and to be, no matter the number of people at one place are gathered, that it be first in order the giving and addressing of great thanksgiving. Then this has become my duty to put this matter forward. Now then, that this day, as it is the sunlight, as it is that peaceful our minds should be, now then, this many of we people that we have come to gather here at this place and at this time, as we put our minds together as one. Ourselves first, we greet one another with great respect and thanksgiving. Let's put our minds together as one. Now truly he has created this earth, whom we call our mother, for whom we are thankful. There he has planted all that we need, that we must have to survive. That is where we take from and keep us happy and our minds content. Now at this point, she is still doing her duties rightly, that the Creator has given her. This then we are very happy, that she is still doing her duties as Creator has given her. Now then, we respectfully and kindly, as one, we put our minds together and acknowledge and give thanks to our dear Mother, our earth. That way, let our minds be together as one. Now he has planted all kinds of grasses, and there he stands all kinds of medicines in case people get sick and we are in need of food to eat, and we are thankful all Creator has given us. I think all of these things Creator has put down here for us, so peacefully we can walk on earth and our minds will be at peace. Peacefully, we will be thinking as we walk about earth. It's very important what he planted and the animals he released, and it will be a benefit for all people. Very carefully, we put our minds together as one and give a great gratitude for all the things he has put down here for us to survive. Now we put our minds together as one. All of these beings were given different duties. They are important duties of strength. The first are the thundering voices that come from the west, the four protectors and the soft gentle winds, and our elder brother the sun, and also our grandmother the moon, and we also add the stars. Now we thank the one who lives in the sky world, our Creator, who every day and every night sends his unconditional love to us. Let's put our minds together as one.
I thank the Chief for the traditional welcome, and I would like to extend a warm welcome to you all. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, and participants, it gives me great pleasure to be at this important event and to share my views on a subject of great import, the threat facing indigenous languages in the contemporary world. In 2007, the General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This important milestone was based on the recognition of the right of indigenous peoples to, inter alia, revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures. The Declaration calls on states to take effective measures in consultation and cooperation with indigenous peoples concerned to combat prejudice and eliminate discrimination and to promote tolerance, understanding, and good relations among indigenous peoples and other segments of society. It also calls for the enactment of policies and laws aimed at preserving and strengthening indigenous languages. The United Nations has clearly been at the vanguard of articulating efforts to proactively address the challenges facing indigenous languages in the modern world. The challenges persist nonetheless. Every fortnight, at least one indigenous language vanishes from the face of the earth. This translates into 2 extinct indigenous languages each month. The status quo is indeed grave. The surviving 4,000 indigenous languages are spoken by a mere 6% of the total world population. Equally noteworthy is the fact that 15% of the poorest people on our planet are indigenous. Some may ask why the extinction of an indigenous language, people, or culture in faraway regions should be a matter of great importance. Some may question humanity's concern with the extinction of any particular way of life and why the United Nations should prioritize such a matter. Indigenous peoples and languages matter for a number of reasons. First is the part that language plays in enabling a people to think systematically about its place in the universe, and especially about how this worldview could be developed and leveraged to find solutions to pressing problems. Indigenous traditions have served as dependable means of acquiring knowledge and transmitting same across generations. This is the case with the knowledge of herbal medicine, tools for fabrication, food processing and preservation, government and public administration, and dispute settlement. Modern pharmaceutical breakthroughs rarely happen except by building on the achievements of the past. It is also generally accepted that human progress hinges on constant interactions between and among the range of languages and traditions existing in the world. Linguistic diversity is essential to the preservation of humanity's common heritage. Unfortunately, the diversity which we acknowledge as critical to humanity's survival is imperiled with every language that goes extinct. With the death of languages, the indigenous people who speak them lose a significant part of their identity. Among the markers of progress are the creation of a permanent forum on indigenous peoples, the organization of interactive informal hearing on indigenous peoples, and the sensitization of the international community to the plight of indigenous peoples. The United Nations has been largely instrumental in raising international awareness about indigenous languages and about the measures that need to be adopted to halt their extinction. As far back as 1982, the United Nations established the Working Group on Indigenous Population. The 2019 International Year of Indigenous Languages is by itself evidence of the United Nations commitment to the preservation of endangered languages. It is my hope that with the cooperation and education and research institutions, as well as private sector and civil society stakeholders, decisive action will be taken to ensure indigenous languages against extinction. Rather than look for whom to blame for the extinction of these languages, the world should focus attention on the measures to apply to ensure the survival of the remaining ones. At the very least, the indigenous people should be imbued with the pride and confidence to speak their languages. The schools have a major role to play here. By integrating indigenous languages into their curricula, they would have fulfilled the vital mission of shielding the languages from external onslaught and internal decay. I urge all indigenous communities to be inspired by the fact that their languages are their cultures and that their cultures are the manifestations of their hopes as members of humankind. A people that lets go its language has, knowingly or by default, relinquished its cultural identity rights, certainly. Excellencies, as we mark the closing of the International Year of Indigenous Languages, it is important that we rededicate ourselves to the cause of promoting these languages. We must realize that in languages are scientific insights, hints of wisdom, and community practices that move civilizations from one stage to another. Finally, I express my gratitude to UNESCO and other agencies for preparing the strategic outcome document of the 2019 International Year of Indigenous Languages. Thank you all for your patience and attention. I now give the floor to the Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, Mr. Lou Thenmin, who is also designated as senior official of the United Nations system to coordinate the follow-up to the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. Undersecretary General.
Your Honorable President of the 74th Session of the United Nations General Assembly, distinguished co-chairs of the Steering Committee for the Organization of the International Year of Indigenous Languages, Ministers and Excellencies, Indigenous Peoples representatives, ladies and gentlemen. We are so delighted to have gathered today in this magnificent General Assembly Hall to commemorate the International Year of Indigenous Languages with friends from all over the world. The United Nations General Assembly proclaimed 2019 as the International Year of Indigenous Languages in recognition of the urgent need to preserve, revitalize, and promote indigenous languages. This closing event highlights that indigenous languages do indeed matter for issues at the heart of the mandate of the United Nations, building peace, sustainable development, and reconciliation. As important as it was, the proclamation of the International Year of Indigenous Languages was only a prelude to a greater milestone. A resolution proclaiming the International Decade of Indigenous Languages to commence in 2022 is expected to be adopted by the General Assembly on December 18th. This will be an opportunity to address the silent crisis confronting many of the world's indigenous languages. The Department of Economic and Social Affairs, serving as the Secretariat for the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, is committed to the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Yet, the marginalization, the expropriation of indigenous peoples' traditional lands and other human rights abuses continue. There is no doubt that indigenous peoples must be empowered politically, economically, and socially. They should not have to give up their language and culture or migrate due to economic needs just to ensure their livelihoods. Mr. President, languages shape how we communicate. They are linked to indigenous peoples' cultures, histories, and identities. With every language that disappears, the world loses a wealth of traditional knowledge. Despite their immense value, indigenous languages continue to disappear at an alarming rate. Unfortunately, there's no census evidence, no accurate details about indigenous languages. Thus, it is urgent that the 2020 World Population and Housing Census ask about regular home use of indigenous languages, not just language spoken. Ladies and gentlemen, too many of the world's 370 million indigenous peoples still lack basic rights. Systematic discrimination and exclusion continue to threaten their ways of life, cultures, and identities. This is contrary to the objectives of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, especially regarding inclusive societies and equality for all. Much work must be done to stop and reverse this development. In closing, I wish to acknowledge and thank all stakeholders involved in the organization of a successful international year, all indigenous peoples who are working tirelessly to preserve their languages and cultures, member states for their continued efforts to promote the preservation of indigenous languages, and UNESCO as the lead UN system agency for engaging with stakeholders and strengthening international cooperation and partnerships in supporting indigenous peoples' initiatives. The United Nations stands ready to support initiatives aimed at realizing the rights of indigenous peoples. I wish this high-level event a great success. I thank you.
I thank the Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs for his statement. I now give the floor to Marie-Paule Rodil, Director of the New York Office of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization.
Honorable President of the 74th session of the General Assembly, Under Secretary General Liu of UNDESA, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to speak to you today on behalf of UNESCO as we close the 2019 International Year of Indigenous Languages. An International Year is an opportunity to raise global awareness on a crucial issue, to engage new actors to act, to work together by sharing values and operating principles. And I am pleased to report to you that this is exactly what we have witnessed in 2019. As the UN lead agency for the year, UNESCO has been privileged to work closely with all of you. I would like to mention, of course, member states representatives, particularly members of the steering committee, permanent observers to indigenous peoples from 7 social cultural regions and UN mechanisms, UN agencies, especially the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, indigenous peoples organizations around the world, as well as many academics. I would like also, Mr. President, to take this opportunity to thank your office for its very efficient cooperation, and in particular for the organization of this event. Let us express our sincere appreciation to all of you. What we have achieved in 1 year is the basis upon which we will continue to act. Our sustained efforts are building a path to support, provide access to, and promote indigenous languages worldwide. Throughout the numerous activities organized this year, we demonstrated that a human rights-based approach to languages was key to the achievement of our goals. This approach should be fully integrated in all our efforts to safeguard, protect, support, and promote languages. This is crucial to ensure the full realization of the rights and fundamental freedoms of the speakers. During this year, substantial achievements have been accomplished. I want to mention the 900 events that have generated an array of social, cultural, educational, and political impacts and benefited from a wide media coverage. Behind the 900 events organized with all actors, the year was a great opportunity to demonstrate that new technologies are a strong support to protect indigenous languages. UNESCO developed several capacity-building activities to promote the application of technological solutions and to create training materials to support indigenous languages. UNESCO also initiated research on the Internet universality indicators and convened researchers from all around the world to promote their work. In 2020, next year, UNESCO will launch a new online platform for the World Atlas of Languages, a repository for linguistic diversity and multilingualism. I hope that many of you will be visiting this platform. Through its recommendation concerning the promotion and use of multilingualism and universal access to cyberspace, UNESCO invites member states to take necessary measures on language issues. Indigenous people are guardians of a knowledge which contains essential information on the subsistence, health, and sustainable use of natural resources. This knowledge is conveyed and transmitted by only one means, language. This is why the safeguarding of indigenous languages is crucial not only for the maintenance of linguistic diversity, but also for the world's cultural and biological diversity. So, protection and promotion of indigenous languages is our common responsibility. UNESCO is eager to hear about the innovation and practices that could inspire us to develop strong future actions for the years to come. Mr. President, multilingualism and protection of indigenous languages are critical to people's ability to transfer their knowledge to future generations, to improve the mutual understanding and the intercultural dialogue as an enabler of the implementation of the Agenda 2030. UNESCO remains committed to continue working on this issue. We are thus grateful to the generous proposal of the government of Mexico to host a high-level event for the International Year in February 2020. Moreover, our next speaker today comes from Mexico. UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador, she has gently and kindly accepted the proposal of our Director General Audrey Azoulay to become UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador for Indigenous peoples. I want to congratulate Yalitza Aparicio, who is an actor. She contributes to UNESCO work to ensure the integration of indigenous peoples everywhere and the realization of their rights. It's also my great honor to congratulate Yalitza Aparicio for being an actor recognized, including by the most important film festival in the world. I want to mention the Festival of Venice, the festival, and also, of course, mention the recognition, the nomination as an Oscar Prize. So congratulations and thank you very much, Yalitza. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the Director of the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization for her statement. I now give the floor to the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization Goodwill Ambassador for Indigenous People, Ms. Yalitza Aparicio. Ms. Aparicio, you have the floor.
I was born in the heroic city of Tlaxiaco, in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico. This is a country which has 68 indigenous languages, and although there are so many, I, like many children, was unaware of their existence. I grew up in a safe atmosphere, with every comfort. I went out with my family one day to a nearby community and looked out, and I noticed something new for myself. I saw and heard my father speaking in a totally different language to the one that I spoke. And I discovered that in my own home there was not only one, but two of these marvelous languages, because my mother and my father both spoke two different languages as well as my own. My father's language was Mixteco and my mother's Triqui. Time went by and I didn't think about the reasons why my brothers and sisters and I spoke only Spanish, and why in my home as well we only spoke in Spanish. Although we went to visit our grandparents at least once a year and heard them speaking such a surprising language for me, and such an unknown language. But I was not totally unaware of this issue, at least in my own heart, because I began to look around me in a different way. I saw that there were few of my schoolmates who spoke their mother tongue, whilst their fathers and their parents and grandparents, just like mine, did. The reason was that they had grown up only hearing and speaking Spanish. We were unable to look at the world through the eyes of these languages. These languages were becoming extinct without us having the opportunity to know them. But our parents were not to blame, as I said at the beginning. They were only trying to protect us, to protect our future. They wanted us to grow up in a perfect world. And the only thing was that they didn't want us to go through the same experience as them, experiences of being discriminated against. They believed that speaking the most perfect Spanish possible would open the door to us to more opportunities, even if this would mean closing the door to our roots. Over the last year, I've had the opportunity to belong to something which I did not feel I could aspire to or even dream of, the cinema. With this experience, I had many marvelous days and others not so marvelous. Many things came to light. There was greater visibility given to people who had never been reflected as human beings on a screen. We were given the opportunity to fight for our dreams and also to demand respect for us as for other people, because we are equal. We are not different or strange beings, as we are often made to feel when we are stared at because of our clothes, which are handmade, or by the colour of our dark skin, the colour of our land. Our physical characteristics which speak for themselves, which speak of who we are and of our pride, for our descendancy, for the languages that we speak, which are codes of our very history and our identity. Today, as Goodwill Ambassador for UNESCO Indigenous Languages, my desire is to help people know more about Indigenous languages, which have existed for so many centuries in our countries. But we have not given an opportunity to these languages to take on their full value or respect. We must find a way of including these languages in education and take the initiative of getting to know and learn about the Indigenous communities which exist around us. Because ignorance always leads to discrimination. We judge what we do not know. My goal is that parents do not feel obliged to forget who they are or where they come from, to forget their roots, or to try to hide their Indigenous languages, to protect their children from a society which discriminates against them, which restricts them, and which boxes them in, both in terms of their job opportunities and overcoming any barriers. No boy or girl should grow up feeling ashamed of their roots. They should know that speaking an Indigenous language is a reason for pride. It reveals a world in all its very rich dimensions. I trust that as we defend our linguistic heritage in each community, other people will get to recognize the beauty behind each mother tongue, because each language contains a unique history. In this Year of Indigenous Languages, as proclaimed by UNESCO, I call upon you to ensure that actions which are being carried out in various countries to rescue languages do not end at the end of the year. Rather, they should continue for the whole of eternity, so that no more of our history is lost. We must value and respect our Indigenous communities. I invite them to reconnect with their roots. Together we can learn to live in a world which is more diverse, richer, and more united.
Gracias.
I thank the UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador for her statement. We'll now hear remarks by two co-chairs of the Steering Committee for the Organization of the International Year of Indigenous Languages. And I give the floor to His Excellency Juan Fernando Velasco Torres, Minister of Culture and Heritage of Ecuador. Honourable Minister, you have the floor.
Señor Presidente,
President, we reaffirm the right of Indigenous peoples to preserve and strengthen their own cultures, just as we recognise our millennial roots forged by women and men of different peoples. we call upon the wisdom of all cultures which enriches our societies, and place great value upon the work undertaken to guarantee the development of peoples according to their aspirations and needs. We underscore the fact that important progress has been made to the benefit of peoples and nationalities within the United Nations system, with regard to following up on the many commitments assumed by states in this area, as is the case for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Ecuador is a multinational and intercultural state with many indigenous peoples and nationalities who conserve their own customs, traditions, and languages, and their collective rights are recognized in and guaranteed in our Constitution. This is why our National Development Plan, known as the Whole Life Plan, affirms interculturality and plurinationality and seeks to bestow renewed value upon different peoples and nationalities. Ecuador is committed to preserving indigenous languages, linguistic diversity, and sustaining intercultural education systems. This is why we were one of the backers helping the aspiration of indigenous peoples of proclaiming 2019 as International Year of Indigenous Languages to become a reality. For Ecuador, it has been a privilege and an honor to have held the co-chairmanship of the steering committee of the annual International Year, and we recognize the work and efforts of UNESCO and DESA in this area, as well as those of other relevant stakeholders in the activities carried out during this year. Nevertheless, we believe that it is important, more than ever before, against the backdrop of the events which have befallen our country and the region, to continue working to preserve, revitalize, and promote indigenous languages as a way of recognizing the needs and demands of all peoples and nationalities. We cannot therefore pass up the opportunity to refer to the proclamation of 2022 to 2032 as the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, as enshrined in the resolution on the rights of indigenous peoples, which will be adopted tomorrow by the United Nations General Assembly. The proclamation of the International Decade, which Ecuador has been very active in creating, aims to call attention to the serious loss of languages and to call for urgent measures to be taken at national and international level to conserve, revitalize, and promote these languages, in the knowledge that this is possible with universal will to address the shared concern of safeguarding the immaterial cultural heritage of humanity. Achieving this objective at national and international level will only be possible by promoting a culture of peace and dialogue, characterized by preventing any form of violence or discrimination, which will guarantee and ensure the peaceful coexistence of all peoples. I thank you.
I thank the Minister of Culture and Heritage of Ecuador for his statement. I now give the floor to Ms. Yalitza Aparicio, President of the Sami Parliament of Norway.
Mr. President, I congratulate you on your election as PGA and thank you for letting us gather here in this hall as we did at the opening of the International Year of Indigenous Languages in February. I greet the people of this land, the Lenape, and all other Indigenous brothers and sisters that have joined in the global celebration of our languages this year. I also greet the Friends of Indigenous Peoples' Languages, including state and UN agency representatives present here today. This year has brought us together, and that itself is a great achievement. I recall the UN General Assembly's resolutions on the enhance participation of Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in all UN meetings on issues affecting them. This year, Indigenous peoples' representatives have been equally participating with the member states in the steering committee and in high-level events. Entering the transition to a decade for Indigenous languages, I encourage UN bodies and member states to secure meaningful and enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples in the future work. This year has illuminated that technological development has much to offer Indigenous languages, if it is developed with our free, prior, informed consent. I am proud that UNESCO and the International Year offered a meeting place for Indigenous peoples, technology providers, and scholars at the Language Technology for All conference in Paris recently. That conference demonstrated why we really need a decade for Indigenous languages. The world is facing a digital leap, and we must make sure that our languages do not lag behind. We have to be able to apply our languages to all the technological opportunities and use it to benefit our peoples and our languages. We have to make sure that our languages are still relevant in the changing world, in urbanized areas, in public services and in education, in media and in popular culture. Speaking of popular culture, I would like to share with you some lyrics from the Sami rap artist Ailo Valle. Mun indarpstaisani go ainan doddarit. I need no words when I see the tundra. His song, Suotnjarapiaivacha, The Rays of the Sun, explores the links between Indigenous knowledge, culture, and nature. The sight of our ancestral lands can be overwhelming, can be humbling, and yet our languages ties everything together. Did you know that tundra is originally a Kildin Sami word, describing a treeless mountain plain? In northern Sami, the word is duottar. I'm sharing these words with you because while we are celebrating Indigenous languages, we also know that we did not succeed in protecting Indigenous lands and livelihoods in the climate negotiations in Madrid the last weeks. That breaks my heart. Environmental change challenges our languages because of the strong connection between languages, Indigenous knowledge, and livelihoods. Our tundra is changing. It is growing trees where there should be none. Sometime in the future, we might not recognize our treeless mountain plains anymore. The only memory we might have left is the word itself, duottar, tundra, the memory of our lands embedded in the language. It is both sad and beautiful at the same time to reflect on how our languages are mirrors of the world we live in. Nevertheless, to use the words of the UN General Secretary, we cannot give up. We have to continue the struggle for climate justice as we close the International Year of Indigenous Languages. This year has been an acknowledgement of the global responsibility for Indigenous peoples' languages, and its legacy should be a message of hope, of shared love of our languages, and finally, a firm call for a decade of Indigenous languages. Giitu, thank you.
I thank the President of the Sami Parliament of Norway for her statement. I now give the floor to Chief Perry Delegate, Assembly of First Nations.
Ka kia no temtik no ako magnak ni sta ne naskamon ke ne naskom tenwa ka kia ogi ma pe so wache sega seo koskateo maskos so skonige no tinia an mutainan semanato kana skomten le napi peoples kana no skomten wow. My friends, my relatives, I'm happy to be here, acknowledging you all as friends and relatives, shaking hands with each and every one of you. I said a little bit in Cree that one of the names I carry is King Thunderbird Child, and I'm from a small reservation called Little Black Bear, southern Saskatchewan, Treaty 4 territory, and I gave thanks to the Creator for this beautiful day. Mr. President, Your Excellencies and delegates, to the elders, knowledge keepers, colleagues, sisters and brothers. So I spoke a little bit in Cree, Neheoin, Plains Cree language. So I wish to acknowledge as well the Lenape peoples on whose traditional territories we come together today. It's an honor to be here with you all on such an important occasion. A lot of good and important work has been done this past year, and it is simply the beginning. Much more work needs to be done. Our languages, they connect us all through our ceremonies, to our lands and to our waters, to our right to self-determination as Indigenous peoples. We have our own languages, our own lands, our own laws, our own peoples, and our own identifiable forms of government. And I know from my sisters and brothers from around the world that this belief is true for all Indigenous peoples. We want our children to grow up with these rich and beautiful languages. This is how our languages are passed on, from the mouths of our knowledge keepers to the ears of our young people. I have the deepest gratitude for all those knowledge keepers and ceremony people who spoke Cree to me. And I give thanks to all our language champions all around the world who continue to teach our young people. Our young people want this vital connection to their ancestors. They want to carry that connection forward to the generations still to come, and that is their fundamental human right. Even studies have shown that when young First Nations people or Indigenous children are fluent in their language, they know who they are and where they come from. They're more successful in school and therefore more successful in life. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples affirms the inherent right of all Indigenous peoples to use, to revitalize, and to pass on to future generations our languages, our writing systems, our literatures, and our names for communities, places, and persons. This is not an abstract goal. And as the Declaration itself states, the right to language is part of the very foundation of the survival, the dignity and well-being of Indigenous peoples worldwide. We all know that colonialism caused profound harm to cultures and traditions of Indigenous peoples around the world, and that even includes the actions trying to destroy our languages. UNESCO has estimated that more than half of the surviving Indigenous languages in the world could disappear before the end of this century. In Canada, generations of our children were taken from their homes and communities because the government did not want them to grow up as First Nations people, as Inuit or Métis peoples. And I know this has happened in many regions throughout the world. As part of this deliberate attempt to destroy our rich and diverse cultures, the children were taken away. They were forbidden to speak their languages, even beaten and abused for speaking their mother tongues. This was often the life experience of the very knowledge keepers who we now depend on to keep our languages alive. So you can see that when we speak our languages and when our young people commit to learning and using our languages, this is nothing less than an heroic victory for us. Today in Canada, there is a very real danger that our Indigenous languages will not survive another century. For our languages to survive, they must be taught throughout the life of every young person, and they must have the opportunity to use their language in every aspect of daily life. It can't be an extraordinary thing. It has to be an everyday, normal, ordinary thing. But in Canada, just 1 in 5 First Nations person is fluent enough in their language to hold a conversation. Our languages represent who we are as part of the human family. They also embody the rich contributions that Indigenous peoples make to the world, because our languages express the wisdom, our worldview, the laws and the lives of our ancestors. Our languages embody traditional knowledge of how to live in balance with Mother Earth. We acknowledge that they will be vital to our common survival as we face the ecological challenges ahead of us. This is the time to come together to ensure the survival of our languages. We can't afford to wait. Back home, there is reason for hope, because we've learned from the elders who preserved the knowledge for us. We've learned from the first-hand experience of our community language champions, the extraordinary learners and teachers who do this work every day. And because of them, the numbers of Indigenous language speakers are slowly starting to grow again. This International Year of Indigenous Languages was an opportunity to raise awareness and share our knowledge on how to best maintain and revitalize our languages. Over the past few years, the Assembly of First Nations worked with the Government of Canada and with our Inuit and Métis sisters and brothers to co-develop groundbreaking legislation that sets out a clear national commitment to Indigenous language reclamation, revitalization, recovery, and maintenance. It's called Bill C-91. This new legislation is important because of the commitments it makes and because of the foundation that it has built for the future. The state of Indigenous language is a national emergency, and it has to be treated as such. We need schools to create and implement effective bilingual and immersion education programs beginning with preschool-age children, and we need programs to inspire all of our people to speak our languages regardless of age, to renew the vibrancy of our communities. And this is true for all Indigenous peoples from around the world. So I say to all the national delegations assembled here today, work with us to help bring Indigenous languages back from the brink of destruction. The UN Declaration calls on all of us to ensure that the right to language is protected, and all states to commit the financial and technical assistance necessary to ensure that this right is fulfilled. Our language knowledge keepers, leaders, and champions know that needs-based funding is essential to supporting the normalization of language fluency. The strategic outcome document of the International Year of Indigenous Languages sets out an agenda to protect and revitalize Indigenous languages around the globe. And a keystone of the strategy is the commitment to the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. The International Year was a good start, but 1 year is simply not enough when we're talking about diverse cultural heritages facing such grave threats after so many decades of suppression and neglect. The International Decade will be an important symbol of the world's commitment. Member states should aim to support the restoration of Indigenous language fluency as a goal for the decade starting immediately. And I know that we can accomplish great things when Indigenous peoples and member states work together in a spirit of cooperation, peace, justice, and friendship. Much has been accomplished in the past year. Let's continue to work together to get this important work done. Egoze, kinanaskum tinuao.
I thank the Chief of the Assembly of First Nations for his statement. And I'll give the floor to Ms. Anne Nogaram, Chairperson of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues.
Excellencies, distinguished President of the 74th session of the General Assembly, distinguished Under-Secretary General of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, distinguished co-chairs of Steering Committee for the Organization of the International Year of Indigenous Languages, distinguished UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador for Indigenous Peoples, distinguished Director of UNESCO Liaison Office, New York, Indigenous peoples representatives. Today's event marks the conclusion of International Year of Indigenous Languages that was born out of the process that started years before. In recognition of the serious demise in the use of indigenous languages, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues recommended that the United Nations organize an expert group meeting on indigenous languages in 2008 and again in 2016. The meetings made important recommendations, including that the United Nations proclaim an International Year of Indigenous Languages. In 2016, the General Assembly adopted the resolution proclaiming 2019 as the International Year of Indigenous Languages, based on the Permanent Forum's recommendation to draw attention to the critical loss of indigenous languages and urgent need to preserve, revitalize, and promote them. In 2019, the Permanent Forum dedicated a thematic discussion to indigenous languages and reiterated that the indigenous languages represent complex systems of knowledge that have been developed over thousands of years and inextricably linked to lands, waters, territories, and resources. Indigenous languages are key, not only in preserving ecosystems, but also ensuring the continuation and transmission of indigenous cultures, customs, and history. They are part of the heritage and identity of indigenous peoples. In this way, each indigenous language represents a unique framework for understanding the world. The Permanent Forum also emphasized that any efforts to promote and revitalize indigenous languages must be owned by indigenous peoples themselves, and that states and UN entities should support such initiatives. Ladies and gentlemen, the Permanent Forum expressed concern on the state of world's indigenous languages and recommended the adoption of a rights-based approach towards indigenous languages that considers the full spectrum of human rights and fundamental freedoms in accordance with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As was stated here earlier, Article 13 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples enshrines the right of indigenous peoples to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their languages. It also emphasizes the right of indigenous peoples to establish and control their own educational systems and institutions to provide education in their own languages. Expanding the use of indigenous languages allows indigenous peoples to have better access to services such as healthcare and better and more culturally appropriate education to ensure their overall well-being. Language barriers also undermine due process of law in legal proceedings. Without accessible courts and institutions, indigenous peoples become vulnerable to actions by others that threaten their lands, natural resources, cultures, sacred sites, and economic livelihoods. To this extent, member states should formulate evidence-based policies, long-term strategies, and regulatory frameworks with the direct involvement of indigenous peoples to ensure the for the protection and revitalization of indigenous languages. That includes adequate funding for implementation. Conservative estimates suggest that more than half of the world's languages will become extinct by 2100. Other equally realistic estimates predict that up to 95% of the world's languages may become extinct or severely endangered by the end of this century. At present, 96% of the world's approximately 6,700 languages are spoken only by 3% of the world's population. The vast majority of the languages that are under threat are indigenous languages. And according to these estimates, most of them will disappear. In order to tackle these dire predictions, the Permanent Forum strongly supported the proclamation of the International Decade on Indigenous Languages adopted at the Third Committee of the General Assembly and shortly will be considered by the plenary. Mr. President, in closing, I would like to thank the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, for its work as the lead United Nations agency for 2019 International Year of Indigenous Languages, and its fruitful collaboration with the Department of Economic and Social Affairs and the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. The Permanent Forum looks forward to working with UN agencies, indigenous peoples, member states, and others to promote indigenous languages and realize the objectives of the International Decade on Indigenous Languages. Kiitos. Thank you.
I thank the chairperson of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for her statement. I now give the floor to Ms. Christian Carpenter, chairperson of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Chairperson of the Rights of Indigenous Expert Mechanism for, Chairperson of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Mr. President, distinguished representatives of Indigenous peoples and member states, I serve as chair of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and as its member from North America. I thank the President and members of the General Assembly for this opportunity to address you. The Expert Mechanism's mandate from the Human Rights Council is to assist states and Indigenous peoples in realizing the aims of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. With respect to language rights, Article 13 of the Declaration provides that Indigenous peoples have the right to preserve, use, and transmit their languages, and that states must ensure this right is protected, including in legal proceedings. Indigenous peoples also have a right to education under Article 14, and language is critical in ensuring other rights such as self-determination, participation, and culture recognized not only in the Declaration, but also in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and ILO 169. Through many years of study on this issue, the Expert Mechanism has come to understand that language rights are critical for individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples. And after a year of even deeper engagement on language rights around the world, I'm encouraged by certain developments, but I must include a somber note as well. Around the world, Indigenous peoples are still dying over language rights. At just this time last year, here in the United States, a little girl from Guatemala died, in part because she could not be understood in her Indigenous language. Jacqueline Cal Maquin was 7 years old when she crossed into the United States from Mexico and was taken into custody by Customs and Border Protection Security. Her father had signed a form attesting to her good health, but the form was not translated into Quechua, the Maya language they spoke. In reality, Jacqueline was critically ill, with a high fever and infection, but her father could not communicate this in Spanish or in English. By the time authorities realized her condition, it was too late, and Jacqueline died in U.S. custody. This is not the only story. In September 2019, across the world in Russia, another Indigenous person died, this time an elder who was a scholar of the Udmurt language. Upon the passage of laws diminishing opportunities for instruction in Indigenous languages, Albert Razin started a protest. He carried a sign reading, "If my language dies tomorrow, then I'm ready to die today." Indeed, Razin did die that day of self-immolation to bring attention to the dire situation of Indigenous languages. Indigenous people should not be dying to protect their languages or because they could not be understood in them. Language rights are human rights. Indigenous peoples and their languages must be protected by all of us. Here are some observations of MRIP from the International Year and suggestions for the decade. First, Indigenous languages are living in communities. Whether several individuals awaking a language from dormancy, as in the Wampanoag tribe of Massachusetts, or entire provinces devoting funds to support language revitalization, as in British Columbia, the commitment and focus of language activists and policymakers is gaining strength. Many Indigenous communities are developing a vision from community-wide fluency to particular cultural needs for the life of their languages going forward. Second, the human rights community has crystallized around an understanding that there's a remedial aspect to language policy. Many states, including the US and Canada, have a history of suppressing and destroying Indigenous languages. These efforts are documented, and the funds spent on them are quantifiable. States have an obligation as a matter of human rights to remedy past violations and ensure non-repetition. As the expert mechanism has said, states must devote at least the amount of resources they once spent destroying Indigenous languages to revitalizing them today. This concept of remedy and commensurability should help to inform funding levels, for example, under the Esther Martinez Native American Language Preservation Act in the United States. Third, research undertaken during the International Year has debunked previous notions that Indigenous languages are archaic. Indigenous languages are used in contexts ranging from science and traditional plant knowledge to law and diplomacy. The courts of the Navajo Nation in the United States, for example, use the Navajo language to illuminate such concepts as ke, nalye, hozo, respect, restitution, and harmony, and how to protect sacred sites in Navajo law. The Cherokee Nation has had a written syllabary since the 1820s and now has agreements with technology companies to use the syllabary on devices and in social media. Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin of the Cherokee Nation will address you later today to discuss these and other measures. Finally, Indigenous peoples, together with states, understand that language policy must be taken holistically with other rights, especially self-determination and participation achieved through free, prior, and informed consent. Language revitalization must be developed in cooperation with Indigenous peoples through consensual agreement with flexibility to adapt to changing needs. In the future, all of society will benefit from the maintenance and resilience of Indigenous peoples' languages, and Indigenous peoples will be able to enjoy the freedom of expression and ability to live a dignified life through the true realization of their language rights. This is the vision of the International Decade on Indigenous Languages. The expert mechanism welcomes the Third Committee's recommendation to the General Assembly to proclaim the decade. We will be here to work with all of you, including the Permanent Forum and other mechanisms, UNESCO and other agencies, to make Indigenous language rights a reality. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the chairperson of the expert mechanism for her statement. Before proceeding further, members are reminded that the plenary segment will begin immediately following this opening segment and continue until 1 p.m. The plenary segment will resume at 3 p.m. in this hall. During the plenary segment, statements will rotate between member states and observers of the General Assembly and representatives of the 7 socio-cultural regions of Indigenous peoples. Relevant United Nations entities will also be given the opportunity to speak. There will be a closing segment at 5:30 p.m. featuring a statement by 2 steering committee members and my closing remarks to be followed by a concluding cultural performance. The opening segment is now concluded.
We will now begin the plenary segment. In order to allow maximum participation by all in the limited time available, I strongly encourage you to be as brief as possible. As noted in the President of the General Assembly's letter dated, can you find it? So where's the mouse? I'm sorry. Okay, thanks. As noted in the President of the General Assembly's letter dated 2nd December 2019, Member States are requested to limit their statements to 3 minutes when speaking in their national capacity and 5 minutes when speaking on behalf of a group. The representatives of the 7 social-cultural regions of indigenous peoples are requested to limit their statements to 5 minutes. All other speakers should limit their interventions to 3 minutes each. Participants with longer statements are encouraged to read a shorter version of their text and submit their full-length statements to the Secretariat for posting on the PaperSmart portal. Statements during the plenary will be delivered from the floor. As we follow the list of speakers, I ask that once you are called, and only then, to please push the microphone button in front of you so that the sound engineer will be able to identify who should be given the microphone. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mark Miller, Minister of Indigenous Services of Canada. Excellency, you have the floor.
Excellencies, elders, Indigenous representatives, heads of delegation. It is an honour to join you today on the traditional territory of the Lenape people. I thank Sid Hill for the opening prayer and for helping us to start this event in the right way. I am pleased to speak in Kanyenkeha, an Iroquoian language that I've been learning for almost 3 years. Canada welcomes the designation by the United Nations of 2019 as the International Year of Indigenous Language. In Canada, we have taken significant steps towards reconciliation with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. One of these steps is the co-development of an Indigenous Languages Act. If we do not act now to protect these beautiful languages, many of us will not hear it for ourselves in the years to come.
Denunce. My name is Mark Miller, Minister of Indigenous Services. I'm honored to be here for the closing of the International Year of Indigenous Languages on behalf of my honorable colleague, the Minister of Canadian Heritage, Stephen Guilbeault. Indigenous languages are fundamental to identities, cultures, spirituality, relationships to the land and to the world, as well as self-determination of Indigenous peoples. 3/4 of the 90 living Indigenous languages in Canada have been identified by UNESCO as endangered.
2019 was a milestone on the road towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Our joint efforts for revitalisation, preservation and strengthening of Indigenous languages in Canada are remarkable.
Is the carrier of stories, the memory of those who came before us, and the promise that we hold for those who come after us.
Throughout the year, Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government have pooled their efforts through celebrating the richness of a culture and Indigenous languages, and also financing community projects and activities, and by legislating to preserve languages.
This last point, legislation and laws. The Government of Canada and Indigenous partners worked relentlessly together to create the Indigenous Languages Act. I want to acknowledge the outstanding work of all Indigenous partner organizations in the co-development of this legislation. I also want to recognize the presence of their leaders here today, National Chief Perry Bellegarde, President Aluki Kotirk, President Clément Chartier, President Clara Morin-Dalcol, Grand Chief Wilton Littlechild, and to the many other leaders here today and those who have also guided the work on Indigenous languages On behalf of the Government of Canada, I want to personally thank everyone involved. I look forward to seeing the work continue with all Indigenous partners in Canada for the co-implementation of the Act in a spirit of mutual trust and respect. Canada is proud to join the world in closing the International Year of Indigenous Languages. I invite the global community to continue to strive for a strong future for Indigenous peoples and their languages. Thank you, merci, miigwech, nakumik, marci, nyawa, toni kawanaga.
The Minister of Indigenous Services of Canada. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Aloha Nunez, Minister for the People's Power for Indigenous Peoples of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Excellency, you have the floor.
Aha, hamaya hiata walayu, amtishia, ikata hamonin totihitawe, akenamano, adigua chawarawa. Un saludo en nuestros idiomas.
This is a greeting in our indigenous languages in Venezuela. We want to thank the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Tihani Mohamed Bande, and the other authorities of the United Nations for organising this important meeting and other commemorative events throughout the year. In particular, we thank and greet on behalf of all the people of Venezuela and our constitutional president, Nicolás Maduro Moros, our brothers and sisters who are representatives of First Peoples across the world and who are meeting here today to pay tribute to the historic and cultural legacy of our ancestors expressed in the oral and written communications, which contains the invaluable wealth of our cosmovision and our spirituality of centuries and millennia in terms of our languages and other forms of communication. More than ever today, given the critical situation of over 3,000 first languages, the commitment of states and peoples must be reaffirmed in preserving and disseminating indigenous languages, one of the richest expressions of the diversity of humanity throughout its history. Achieving the great aspirations of this organisation in a world of conflict, interventionism and great social challenges necessarily means the active inclusion of our First Peoples in re-evaluating their historic essence and their languages as a crucial tool to build and promote peace, reconciliation and the Sustainable Development Goals, which we have just 10 years to achieve. In the Constitution of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, we underscore the multi-ethnic and pluricultural character of our society, where there are over 43 indigenous peoples with over 724,000 inhabitants, and they speak 36 indigenous languages, which many have been recognized as official languages of Venezuela as part of the historic recognition of pluralism and cultural diversity in our country. For 20 years, we have also been implementing active programs and policies in all corners of our nation to defend the human rights and to value our ancestral values with a full respect for our ancestral customs and practices. As a daughter of Indigenous America and a warrior who is committed in my day-to-day life on the ground to the most urgent needs of the Venezuelan First Peoples, I wished to take the opportunity of this important tribune to reiterate the international criticism of the Bolivarian government of Venezuela to important sectors of the world on the illegal and immoral implementation of unilateral coercive measures, which have become a criminal blockade against human rights in the whole of my country, and which also seriously affect indigenous peoples. The governing elite in the United States of America, in its intolerance and anti-democratic desire to destabilize the country and overthrow the legitimate government, including through war, has not ceased to attack the Venezuelan people and its economy, depriving them of access to the international bank and preventing free trade, and coercing banks and businesses to paralyze their economic relations in all sectors of the country. This causes harm to the people as a whole, and their health, their food, and other goods and services. We call for the lifting of this blockade immediately. This is an interventionist policy which failed in 2019 and will continue to fail. President, at the closure of the International Year of Indigenous Languages, I should wish to highlight that the Bolivarian government of Venezuela has launched school books in various indigenous languages, such as Au, Cariña, Warau, Chaima, Yukpa, and Wayu. inter alia. This includes thousands of teachers, translators, students, and researchers from our Indigenous peoples as part of a process of liberating intercultural and multilingual education. We also highlight the efforts to preserve the Mapoyo language, which is in danger of dying out. This was included by UNESCO in 2014 as immaterial cultural heritage of humanity. It is a duty of governments to increase the numbers of policies to preserve and disseminate Indigenous languages as a guarantee of the continuity and wealth of our millennial Indigenous heritage, which ennobles humankind. Finally, the policies for inclusion and value of our First Peoples in Venezuela are one of the greatest strengths of our social policies in recent times, and a tangible contribution in complying with Agenda 2030 and the SDGs in our country. This is enshrined also in our Homeland Plan for 2019 to 2025, which includes demands regarding our values and cultures, as well as greater political participation, benefits in education, health, culture and sport, as laid out in the national action plans. This involves the most vulnerable sectors of society as protagonists in social structural policies, particularly our Indigenous peoples. This is a demonstration of the commitment of the Venezuelan government and state in implementing the various instruments agreed upon and international fora held in the context of the United Nations and other regional fora, and also in implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished Minister of Venezuela, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico, speaking on behalf of the Group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples. Mexico, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is my pleasure to deliver this statement on behalf of the Group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples. Together, we are a cross-regional group of 20 states, comprised by Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Bolivia, Canada, Colombia, Denmark, Dominica, Ecuador, El Salvador, Estonia, Finland, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Norway, New Zealand, Spain, Paraguay, Peru, and my own country, Mexico. The Group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples is truly honored to be here today. We greet and welcome the representatives of Indigenous people, all of whom play a key role in the promotion and protection of Indigenous languages, knowledge, and culture. We also commend the leadership of the President of the General Assembly for convening today's high-level event on occasion of the conclusion of the International Year of Indigenous Languages. The idea of dedicating an international year to the promotion and protection of Indigenous languages was born out of a recommendation issued in 2016 by the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues. Since then, the Group of Friends has taken up, supported, and accompanied the initiative that brings us to this hall today. The International Year has been instrumental to raise awareness of the critical need to revitalize, preserve, and promote Indigenous languages. In this regard, we would like to highlight the importance of regional events held this year promoted by member states with the support of UNESCO. Thanks to the awareness raised, it is evident that much still remains to be done, and sustained efforts beyond 2019 must be made to address the challenge of preserving the cultural heritage they represent. Concerned by the alarming rate at which Indigenous languages are disappearing around the world, we promoted the initiative to dedicate an entire decade to reverse this trend and protect Indigenous languages. Tomorrow, at this great hall, the General Assembly will adopt a resolution proclaiming 2022-2032 as the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. We thank our friends from the delegations of Bolivia and Ecuador for their steadfast guidance in facilitating this resolution. Looking back, the year we close today has served as a crucial platform to lay the groundwork for the International Decade. We commend the important work carried out by UNESCO as the lead agency for the organization of the International Year, as well as the work of the Steering Committee and the UN Secretariat. Their engagement has been fundamental to success of the International Year. Madam Chair, linguistic diversity is indeed a form of human wealth. It is a cultural treasure and a key instrument to realizing sustainable development, good governance, peace, and reconciliation. We stand much to lose when indigenous language is no longer used. Language plays an integral role in maintaining identity, sustainability, vitality, and the strength of indigenous cultures around the world. As we look forward to the International Decade, the group of friends renews its commitment to promote the knowledge of indigenous languages and the rights of indigenous peoples to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures as set out by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We thank you, and I will briefly speak now on behalf of my own country, Mexico, if you allow me, Madam. Señora Presidenta,
Madam President, Mexico has participated in the activities of the International Year of Indigenous Languages with great commitment and interest. Mexico is a pluricultural and multi-ethnic nation. We are proud that UNESCO has named Yalitza Aparicio as a Goodwill Ambassador for Indigenous Languages. We have a great and unique linguistic wealth, which is expressed and reflected in 68 indigenous languages. 6 out of every 100 Mexicans, that is 7.4 million people, speak one of the national indigenous languages. To preserve and develop Mexican indigenous languages is, therefore, to preserve and develop Mexico's multicultural wealth. Madam President, languages are much more than tools for communication. They are unique systems of knowledge and understanding of the world. Every indigenous language has an incalculable value for humanity. The International Year of Indigenous Languages has been a fundamental instrument to promote the protection of languages across the world. It has also been a useful mechanism to draw attention to the serious loss of indigenous languages. To this end, and with deep conviction, Mexico supported the initiative of devoting an international decade to the promotion and protection of indigenous languages in the world. The International Decade of Indigenous Languages will give us the opportunity to continue the work of conserving, revitalizing, and promoting indigenous languages. Accordingly, Mexico, along with UNESCO, will organize on the 27th and 28th of February next year a high-level event on indigenous languages. Madam President, the world contains around 7,000 languages. Almost half of them are at risk of dying out. The vast majority of these are indigenous languages. On average, every 2 weeks, a language disappears. At this pace, by the end of the 21st century, the world will have lost around 2,000 languages, which will be a great loss, a very great loss for the whole of humanity. Linguistic, cultural, and biological diversity in the world are intimately linked to indigenous languages and their speakers. Preserving the indigenous languages of this world is to care for the heritage of humanity. Protecting indigenous languages is to ensure that ancestral wisdom and traditional knowledge, forms of governance, and unique identities will be transmitted to future generations. However, recovering and maintaining the vitality of an indigenous languages is no mean feat. This challenge can only be accomplished through cooperation and coordination between states, the United Nations system, the indigenous peoples, civil society, and academia. Our joint efforts in this important task must always happen, of course, with the participation of indigenous peoples in a decisive way. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Mexico for his statements, and I now give the floor to the indigenous peoples representative of the socio-cultural region of Africa, Mr. Handane Mohammed. Mr. Mohammed, you have the floor.
أيتمدي استماع أزل في اللون اسمي بهرة أديدون دروح أولاد اللي إيجان وين إمدان نمزورة Madame la Présidente, merci.
President, thank you for having given me the floor. It's a great honor today to speak here in the hall of the General Assembly of the United Nations to celebrate a particular event, that of the International Year of Indigenous Languages 2019. The topic of Indigenous issues is becoming more and more common. There are many meetings of the United Nations, and it is becoming a topic that is being taken seriously within each member state of the United Nations. This explains why, because the international community is aware of the importance of the reconciliation of humanity with its own history, its cultures, and its origins. And as humanity has just one origin, all languages and cultures belong to us without exception. The International Year for Indigenous Languages in 2019 should not just be a simple event. Its impact, without an impact on humanity's history, it is in fact a historic event, which marks simply the beginning of a profound cultural and moral renewal of the international community, as carried by the race towards overproduction of technology and material goods. Ladies and gentlemen, in the region of Africa, several activities were organised, despite the fact that the number of these events does not reflect the power of the African continent, which is home to more than a third of the indigenous languages around the world. And thus it has a great indigenous responsibility, as the African continent is really the cradle of humanity. I would, however, like to congratulate the African Union, who stepped up to the plate at this occasion of the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and they established a committee for Amazigh language, which is the oldest indigenous African and Mediterranean language. I would also like to take this opportunity to congratulate Morocco, who has made this language official since 2011. I'd also like to congratulate Algeria for having made this mother tongue of Africa an official language. I'd like to congratulate all of the indigenous peoples of Africa who have protected this enormous universal treasure despite the crosswinds of globalization. Ladies and gentlemen, during 2019, the world saw various activities on indigenous languages. National, regional, international colloquia were held Debates were started within countries on Indigenous languages. And this debate will be scientific and will have a positive impact. And it must not be interrupted. It must indeed continue as part of the objectives that were already sketched out by the International Year. For example, exchange of knowledge, peace building, rights, and linguistic diversity, so that our planet may become sustainable. And the linguistic and cultural transition must be implemented much like the energy transition. And for this debate to continue, we would make a few recommendations. Firstly, the adoption of the United Nations Decade on Indigenous Languages. Then, creation of universities for Indigenous peoples in the regions of Indigenous peoples, aiming to promote these languages and to create databases of traditional knowledge too, so that they can then be adapted to the effects of climate change. Next, create a global fund to promote Indigenous languages. And finally, create UNESCO prizes for the promotion of Indigenous languages for countries and for civil society. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the Indigenous peoples representative of the Socio-Cultural Region of Africa for his statement. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Peru.
Gracias, señora Presidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Peru expresses gratitude for having devoted this year, 2019, to our Indigenous languages. This made it possible for a number of events and activities to be held across the world, allowing greater attention to be focused on Indigenous languages and the pressing need to adopt new, urgent measures to conserve, revitalize, and promote these languages. A language is a fundamental element of the peoples which speak it. It symbolizes thousands of years of human development and cultural identity. Therefore, the dying out of a language is a serious and sad loss for the whole of humanity. Therefore, in its constitution and laws, Peru recognizes the right to use of its 48 first languages and seeks their preservation, development, recovery, promotion and dissemination through various legal provisions, programs and projects. These measures are aimed at reaching over 4 million Peruvians, around 16% of our population. And their aim is a change in the country to consolidate an intercultural and multilingual state which meets the needs of its citizens and addresses them in their mother tongue, allowing them also access to fundamental services such as education, health or justice. In 2017, the National Policy on First Languages was approved. The aim of this is to guarantee the linguistic rights of the speakers of any Indigenous language by bringing in changes and improvements in the functioning of the public administration and providing public services. We have trained bilingual officials and translators for this purpose. We've also created the Living Voices program to recover endangered Indigenous languages, to ensure that our ancestral linguistic knowledge is not lost. Internationally, Peru is firmly committed to ILO Convention 169 on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, through which provisions must be adopted to preserve and promote the use of first languages. Last September, Peru organized the Regional Congress for Latin America and the Caribbean on Indigenous languages, with the valuable support of UNESCO. This event generated a constructive space for debate with new focuses on native languages. Amongst the conclusions of this Congress appears the proposal of declaring the Decade of Indigenous Languages as a necessary period to undertake and consolidate actions proposed during this international year. We trust that this declaration will unanimously be supported by this Assembly tomorrow when the resolution on the rights of indigenous peoples is addressed. Madam President, all of these actions attest to the Peruvian state's firm commitment to the use, preservation, recovery, and promotion of first languages with the aim of guaranteeing a valuable cultural heritage, but, more importantly still, of achieving a society which is more inclusive, so as to leave no one behind. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Peru for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Muy buenos días, señor.
Good morning, Madam President. My delegation would like to express gratitude for the presentations we have heard and aligns itself with the statement by the group of peoples of indigenous peoples. We particularly greet the representatives of indigenous communities and thank them for all their work to protect and promote indigenous culture and wisdom. For Colombia, it is an honor to have hosted the 14th session of the Intergovernmental Committee for the Safeguard of Immaterial Cultural Heritage, which was held in Bogota last week. In this regard, I would like to reiterate the words of the President of the Republic, Dr. Iván Duque, who said that hosting this event was also a tribute to a country which loves culture, with a rich and diverse heritage. Madam President, Colombia has approximately 68 native languages spoken by around 850,000 people. These include 65 indigenous languages. To give greater visibility to, preserve and conserve the different languages, we have a number of tools, such as the Sound Map of Native Languages. This is a virtual platform allowing visitors to navigate, to travel throughout the country, to visit, get to know and learn, but above all to hear 37 indigenous peoples, both Palenques, Creoles and Gypsies who live in our country and are conserving their language as a fundamental part of their very identity. In the context of the International Year of Indigenous Languages and the Day for Native Languages, the Government of Colombia produced 10 radio ads, 2 audiovisual pieces, and 10 messages in different languages for social networks with a view to promoting the value of indigenous languages. We also have another virtual platform, the Languages of Colombia platform, which allows researchers, teachers, students, and the public in general to share experiences and information on the languages of Colombia. For my country, translations to native languages are of vital importance, since they are part of our strategies for cultural dialogue with ethnic groups. They are also a tool for the recognition and greater visibility, which promotes the right to equal opportunities, ensures the principle of non-discrimination, and are an exercise which contribute to eliminating racial discrimination. Thus, the agreement to end the armed conflict was translated into 60 native languages and had around 150 participants included in doing this, including those speakers of native languages. The decision to give back ethnic territorial rights was also translated and interpreted into Yukpa language. These are 2 of the very valuable examples of the commitment of the government of my country to the respect, conservation and preservation of indigenous culture. Madam President, it is an honor to belong to this group of friends, which under the leadership of Mexico as President and Bolivia and Ecuador as facilitators of the resolution this year, achieved the proclamation of 2022 to 2032 as International Decade for Indigenous Languages. All of you can count on the commitment of the Government of Colombia to protect and preserve the culture and wisdom of Indigenous people. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Colombia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Indigenous Peoples representative of the Socio-Cultural Region of the Arctic, Ms. Aluki Kotiek. You have the floor, Ms. Kotiek.
Uqawsivut sangi jutivut. Uqawsivut atawsiw jutivut. Uqawsivut pilirit jutivut. Uqawsivut ilagi tiagotivut. Uqawsivut qanuingi tiagotivut. Our language provides us with strength. Our language unites us. Our language is our medium of work. Our language strengthens our relationships. Our language is the foundation for our well-being. These are the words of the late Henry Itluangnek from Akviat, Nunavut. It is important that the United Nations General Assembly adopt a resolution proclaiming an International Decade of Indigenous Languages. As Arctic peoples, our language rights must be recognized and protected. The Inuit Circumpolar Council passed a resolution supporting the proclamation of an International Decade of Indigenous Languages between 2022 and 2032. We have much work to do to address the language inequities. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that human dignity is considered to be the foundation for all human rights. Article 13 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples clearly states our indigenous language rights. I am the president of Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, an organization that represents Nunavut Inuit. Nunavut is one of 3 territories in Canada. There are 25 communities spread across 2 million square kilometers. If Nunavut was its own country, it would be the 13th largest country in the world. In Canada, our language is considered to be one of the stronger indigenous languages. In Nunavut, Inuit make up 85% of the population, and 70% identify Inuktitut as their mother tongue. Nunavut is the only jurisdiction in Canada where the public majority is not one of the federally recognized official languages of French or English. In fact, the 2016 census identifies the following mother tongue speakers in Nunavut: 11,745 English speakers, 640 French speakers, and 24,050 other. Despite this, Inuktitut is not the working language of our government, nor is it the language used to provide essential public services. It concerns me that unilingual Inuktitut speakers are not receiving equitable public services similar to those of other Canadians. It is a safety issue. During the International Year of Indigenous Languages, as Canada was about to enact a federal Indigenous Languages Act, I had very reasonable expectation that our language at last would receive the recognition and support that it requires to continue to thrive. The commitment that the public majority Inuit population in Nunavut would receive essential public services in Inuktitut. Despite the legislation's fundamental shortcomings, Inuit are pleased that the Government of Canada, Government of Nunavut, and Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated announced the joint intention to support, revitalize, and strengthen Inuktitut in Nunavut through a Pathfinder Agreement under the Canadian Indigenous Languages Act. This would allow the Uqariksainik initiative to focus efforts on drastically increasing the number of Inuktitut-speaking Inuit educators in Nunavut schools to reverse the teacher shortage crisis within 10 years. Indeed, during the decade on Indigenous languages. With a focus on rights, A decade dedicated to Indigenous languages would provide us with the opportunity to draw needed attention to Arctic Indigenous languages and the urgent shared need to do more to help protect, strengthen, revitalize, and promote our languages. Koyan nami pivikakteteugama.
I thank the Indigenous peoples representatives of the socio-cultural region of the Arctic, Ms. Kotiak. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Paraguay. Paraguay, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Paraguay aligns itself with the statement by Mexico on behalf of the group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples. It is a great satisfaction for Paraguay to be part of this closing event of the International Year of Indigenous Languages. This is a year which has been fundamental to raise awareness over the alarming loss of indigenous languages around the world. These languages are treasures of humanity. Paraguay is a multicultural and plurilingual country, which has a great wealth in its diversity of 19 languages spoken by indigenous peoples. Each one of these languages is part of our national essence, and one in particular, Guarani, is so rooted in our identity that it's impossible to even imagine Paraguay without this language. We are proud to be a nation whose indigenous and non-indigenous population speaks Guarani on a day-to-day basis. This is the indigenous language of our region with a great cultural wealth. This year, the government passed Law 6352, creating the Commission for the Commemoration of the International Year of Indigenous Languages. This commission will remain in place until November 2020. Madam President, the knowledge and cosmovision of indigenous peoples, as captured in their languages, are the key to many of the solutions which we need to live a life which is more in harmony with nature, which has sustainable patterns of production and consumption, which can transform the lives of present generations to preserve future generations and their future, as we recall in Agenda 2030. However, and despite their great value, all indigenous languages are vulnerable. This year has been key to promote actions which are necessary to address the root causes threatening the survival of the over 4,000 indigenous languages which exist in the world. It is fundamental to maintain this impetus, this awareness, not to lose the focus on the importance of continuing to pay attention to the serious situation of these languages. Madam President, to conclude, my country wishes to pay tribute to one of the most notable linguists in Latin America, Father Bartolomeo Meliá, who was a tireless warrior for the rights of indigenous peoples and their languages. A Quaraiguaçu, who with his great knowledge affirmed that a language dies if it is not spoken. In his memory, Paraguay reaffirms its commitment to indigenous languages remaining alive and being transmitted from generation to generation. Whatever we do not know is difficult for us to value and admire. This is why we must feel called upon from all sectors to better know indigenous people, to learn from them, their cosmovision, their philosophy, and the profound wisdom that they express through their languages. We must overcome indifference to indigenous peoples and their environment, because without a habitat, languages and cultures will grow weaker and run the risk of disappearing. This must be avoided across the world. We must never become discouraged and continue our joint efforts to strengthen languages and their speakers. Long live indigenous languages in the world. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Paraguay for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of New Zealand. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Ina mana, ina reo, ina iwi, I rao rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. All peoples of the world, all speakers, all the chiefly peoples here, all groups, greetings to all gathered here. Madam Chair, I started my address to you today in Te Reo Māori, the Indigenous language of New Zealand. To those who have worked hard to make this International Year possible, ngā mihi nunui, I extend a particular thank you to you all. For New Zealand, the International Year of Indigenous Languages has been a helpful and constructive framework to support the work of Te Taura Whiri, the Māori Language Commission, and their strategy for Māori language revitalisation. The strategy aims that, by 2040, 85% of New Zealanders will value Te Reo Māori as a key part of national identity. A particular focus for this year has been on engaging with young New Zealanders, recognising that to revitalise our first language, we need young New Zealanders to help make this happen. In New Zealand, we know that culture, tradition, and knowledge are ingrained within languages. This highlights the importance of Indigenous languages to Indigenous peoples, their identities, their well-being, and their futures. But we also recognise the value of Indigenous languages to society more broadly. This is because language is essential to unlocking, understanding, and transmitting Indigenous perspectives and knowledge. These perspectives that put our children and future descendants at the centre can help us tackle intergenerational challenges such as peace building and sustainable development. The theme for today's meeting underscores the importance of continued efforts to promote and protect Indigenous languages. We welcome the increased attention that an International Decade for Indigenous Languages will bring to this work. As we look ahead to the decade, New Zealand hopes that Indigenous knowledge, indivisible from Indigenous languages, will be seen as an essential part of this work. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of New Zealand, and I now give the floor to the Indigenous Peoples representative of the socio-cultural region of Asia, Mr. Nicholas Bala. You're not speaking.
Your Excellency, Madam Chair, Your Excellencies, Member States, and distinguished Indigenous brothers and sisters from all over the world. In my language, Johar, Aapki Jai, Jai Seva, greetings from tribals, Adivasis of India, Asia. As steering committee member for organizing International Year of Indigenous Language 2019, I had the opportunity to participate in 6 international meetings around the world, one in Changsha in China, one in Purdue University in Fort Wayne, Indiana in USA, 2 in Paris, and 2 in UN here, including this meeting. It was impressive to see the initiative taken by the Republic of China, Changsha University, the scholars and professors, students of China, who had then identified over 15 endangered languages and were working for their survival in In Purdue University, again, we were about 400 participants across the world with local governments, university, lots of intellectuals and social activists. And I was happy to learn that there are more than 650 different linguistic groups of population still continue to live in their distinct languages and cultures in Indiana, USA. In Paris, it was very interesting to participate in the meeting for language tool for all. There also we participated more than 400 intellectuals, information technology companies, governments, and indigenous leaders. In my own country, India, we had 3 national level conferences. Though government does not recognize us indigenous people, we are called tribals, tribes, Adivasis, scheduled tribes, etc. But in the meetings, the tribal minister from Madhya Pradesh, one of the governor from Chhattisgarh, and 2 of the vice chancellors from Mysore University, so many professors, both indigenous and non-indigenous, all we participated, and we see a bright future from all. Madam Chair, the United Nations 2030 Vision Sustainable Development Goals, where no one will be left behind, I feel this is one of the ways to get involved, though lots to be done yet. When I see around the world, I find, of course, that tribes, the indigenous peoples, are economically weaker than others. It has its own historical and painful past because of superiority feelings, exploitative, dominant, and suppressive nature, who knowingly or unknowingly impose their cultures, languages, snatched away our resources, etc., which I do not want to go in. But I am proud and dare to say that we, the indigenous people, still exist. We, the indigenous people, existed in the past, are existing now, and will exist in the future. UN Declaration of the International Year of Indigenous Languages 2019 created opportunity, lots of hope, lots of scope for preservation, revitalization, promotion, development of the indigenous peoples through the languages and cultures. We have very rich cultures and traditions, very distinct knowledge system, sciences, and languages, which are not known to others. We are equally civilized peoples like anyone else in the world who lived on this Mother Earth for thousands of years. UN and UNESCO and all of us placed the theme recognition, reconciliation, peace building, good governance, healthcare, quality education with mother tongue, and sustainable development. Having spoken all this, I would like to draw for Asia, from where I come. Asia is the largest of all continents in the globe with 49 countries, covering about 30% of the world land, and it has more than 60% of the world population. More than half languages are existing in Asia. And therefore, I have the following recommendations, particularly for the Asia and for also all. All the member states in Asian countries could ratify the ILO Convention 169, recognize the tribes, Adivasis, scheduled tribes, or in any names we are called, give them the status as indigenous peoples in your respective countries, and implement United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People 2007 in letter and spirit. Number 2, the UNESCO could play a mediator role in bringing together the member states and the indigenous people leaders, scholars and experts, and identify the endangered languages and cultures, and make a plan with respective member states with a specific budget to protect, promote, and revitalize the languages and cultures of vulnerable, endangered indigenous tribal groups. Third, the member states could develop governance system with a special administrative structure for planning, decision-making, and implementation by the indigenous peoples, community leaders with financial powers in their countries. Fourth, all the member states in United Nations mechanism to organize such meetings in your respective countries in Asia, so that the indigenous peoples come forward in achieving the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Fifth, The education policy in the member states be inclusive of indigenous people languages and cultures with their special syllabus from elementary to higher education level. Finally, Madam Chair, let us join together in building communities that are sustainable and build a world where every culture and every race can coexist in harmony and peace in line with vision of United Nations 2030, where no one is left behind. I also propose UN to declare the Decade of International Year of Indigenous Languages officially for further revitalization and growth of humanity. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank the distinguished Indigenous Peoples representative of the Socio-Cultural Region of Asia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Norway. Norway, you have the floor.
Thank you. President, Excellencies, Norway welcomes this occasion to reflect as we come to the end of the International Year of Indigenous Languages. Norway is proud to be one of the 10 governmental partners of the International Year. And we welcome the opportunity to discuss ideas, challenges, and good practices on strengthening Indigenous languages. We particularly welcome the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in today's event. To hear their reflections on our work during this year, effective participation by Indigenous peoples themselves is crucial. As we know, Indigenous peoples make up less than 6% of the global population, but they speak more than 4,000 of the world's languages. Each of these languages represent our shared history and culture. As noted in the action plan, knowledge is often captured in specific words, which can't always be easily transferred between languages, meaning that the loss of an Indigenous language could also mean the permanent loss of knowledge. Knowledge which could help us build peaceful, resilient societies and ensure sustainable development. And as the International Year highlights, Indigenous languages are in a particularly vulnerable situation. According to UNESCO, around 2,680 languages are endangered languages, and among them are the Sami languages spoken in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. Unfortunately, this is a situation that I have personal experience with. I have lost the Indigenous Sami language of my ancestors. For generations, we saw a rapid decline in persons openly declaring themselves to be Sami in Norway, not daring to speak our language. This was the case for my grandparents, meaning that I never grew up hearing the Indigenous Sami language or knowing about my Indigenous heritage. Sadly, my family's history is all too common, and it's faced by so many Samis in Norway, and I'm sure other Indigenous peoples across the globe. Luckily, this is changing. My generation is returning to our heritage with pride, as I have, and we no longer feel the shame of our grandparents. Our children are proud to identify themselves as Indigenous Sami. The ability to speak the language is key to unlock both the identity and the knowledge of Indigenous peoples. President, all this to say, we truly understand the need to preserve linguistic diversity. Through modern technology and traditional ways, we must continue to promote and revitalize Indigenous languages. And Norway welcomes the spotlight that this International Year has shown on this important issue. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Norway for her statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished Deputy Permanent Representative of Estonia. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Madam President.
Estonia is glad to join the high-level event today. The promotion and preservation of indigenous languages is paramount for cultural identity, diversity, traditions, and intercultural dialogue. It should be a common concern for us all. We would like to thank UNESCO, the Secretariat, the representative of the indigenous peoples, and all other stakeholders who have contributed to the successful organization of the International Year. In this regard, we are glad to note that the indigenous people have been able to participate on an equal footing in the overall activities of the year, including in the work of the steering committee, the preparation of the outcome document, as well as in regional and local events. We hope to see a continued engagement of the indigenous peoples in the UN discussions in the future. Estonia has been proud to actively participate in the steering committee of the year and contribute, including financially, to its activities. We note with satisfaction that the International Year has gained attention globally with more than 800 activities directly linked to it. The year has also been celebrated in Estonia, including through several awareness-raising activities. Its framework was also successfully used to draw attention to local dialects that are crucial for the expression and transmission of intangible cultural heritage. I myself come from an island with a local dialect, and I am immensely proud of it. The annual Finno-Ugrian Days were focused in particular on the importance of indigenous languages with the aim to share best practices for the protection and preservation of disappearing languages. Estonia continues to support the Finno-Ugric indigenous peoples with whom we share a common language family. Almost 20 years ago, Estonia launched its Kindred Peoples program to support cultural and educational activities among the Finno-Ugric peoples. Next year, Estonia will organize the 8th World Congress of the Finno-Ugric people. Despite their indispensable value, indigenous languages around the world continue to disappear at alarming rates. The international community, including all states, need to step up efforts to preserve and revitalize indigenous languages. We are therefore glad that this goal will receive further attention throughout the decade of indigenous languages starting in 2022. In going forward, we emphasize the importance of making use of modern technologies to advance the promotion of linguistic diversity, multilingual internet, and language technologies which take into account indigenous languages. Estonia is a regular donor to the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Populations, which facilitates the participation of the representative of indigenous peoples in UN meetings affecting them. We hope that many new donors will join us in supporting the fund in the coming years. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished Deputy Permanent Representative of Estonia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished Indigenous Peoples Representative of the Socio-Cultural Region of Eastern Europe, Russian Federation, Central Asia, and Transcaucasia, Mr. Alexei Saikarev. Sir, you have the floor.
Terveh teile, hyvät rahvas, уважаемая госпожа председатель.
President, representatives of indigenous peoples and states. It's an honor for me to speak here on behalf of indigenous peoples of my region, who have a high level of cultural diversity. This region has varying numbers of indigenous peoples, from hundreds of thousands to peoples, or to some peoples who are only in the dozens. The issue of preserving indigenous languages for the majority of peoples is a very important issue. They are linked to economic activity, the identity of the peoples, and development as separate peoples in their own right. The fate of indigenous languages is also closely linked to historic events, intergenerational traumas, and controversial policies that have led to problems of lost generations, where they've stopped being able to teach children their own in a natural way. Therefore, indigenous peoples in our region are placing great hopes on the International Year of Indigenous Languages, believing that it will allow us to return the hope to our linguistic communities and drawing attention of politicians to the need to take urgent measures to support linguistic diversity. Amongst the main priorities is the education system. At the same time, indigenous peoples understand that this is more broader and flexible than how the state understands it. Often there are very bureaucratic mechanisms for printing textbooks in mother tongues. There's also complex concepts that are written actually in the state language, not the indigenous language. Sometimes this undermines human and intellectual resources and does not actually reflect the cultural identity and of the indigenous peoples in the educational process. At the same time, we welcome the fact that the states, including thanks to the Year of Indigenous Languages, have started to change their policy and pay more attention to issues of linguistic rights. The result of procurement projects, for example, in the Republic of Karelia in Russia. On the proposal of the Karelians, there was a resource and media centre for Karelians and Finns. They've changed their attitude to successful practices, and they are ready to continue to do so. A significant project to promote the use of indigenous languages on the online and in ICTs has also been launched. There's also a forum for youth. For example, in the Komi Republic, we have a successful centre for innovative technology. And also elsewhere, we have where the Hanti and Mansi people live, there is a digital centre opened as well. We also are looking at fundamental issues. Is the government ready to recognise the errors of the past and invest suitable resources to address the situation? Linguistic languages should not remain on the periphery of national policies. They deserve and it should not be funded as a residual principle. Real efforts require real investment and political will. And moreover, in their rhetoric and discourse, they really need to reference to the economic factors being the most decisive. It's not worth expecting economic dividends to come straight away, but they need to support the prosperity of this, and this will have a positive impact on many spheres of community life, including health, peace and security, quality education, and many other issues. In the region, we have an understanding that only through joint efforts of states and indigenous peoples, of the state and the informal education systems too, will we be able to achieve successful results. We support the strategic outcome document following the International Year, and the theory also that strengthening the institutions of civil society and public organisations of indigenous peoples will contribute to preserving and ensuring the sustainable development of their languages. President, I'd like to make a few recommendations in conclusion. Firstly, we need an ongoing monitoring of the state of indigenous languages, both in the education system and in other spheres. Secondly, multilingualism. Many languages do not have written form, but they're not sometimes missing for education system. So, therefore, efforts to allow indigenous peoples to create and oversee their own writing system in the alphabet that they choose for themselves. Thirdly, we need to accelerate the process for creating teachers in institutions for indigenous peoples. Fourthly, indigenous peoples in the regions are very much looking forward to a census in 2020. Unfortunately, this could show new worrying data on the numbers of indigenous peoples and the numbers of speakers of their indigenous languages. So we need some serious preparation for this census. Finally, we need to do a lot of work to ensure that indigenous peoples, their names can be used, their own names for towns, rivers, and natural resources that were actually changed from the originally indigenous language. Finally, President, I'd like to draw attention to how we treat vulnerable small languages and the dominant Laga languages. For example, in the Sakha and Yakutia, some of the biggest regions in Russia. In this region, there are two state languages, Russian and Sakha. And there's 5 additional indigenous languages which are official in that region. One of them is the Yukagir language, with only 1,500 people speak. Leaders of one of the elders of these people recently spoke to other peoples, including the Sakha and Ruski peoples and Russian peoples. And he said, remember that these small indigenous peoples of the north are on the front line to preserve ourselves as peoples. And while we're still here, we can be calm. But perhaps we should have different programs set up to preserve our mother tongues, cultural programs, also youth programs. There will also be peoples behind us who will do so. The Association of Peoples in this region also recalled that the fight for linguistic rights of indigenous peoples and the fight for their rights generally is a fight for the interests of all peoples, not just theirs. Ovakili Amamieli, One Light, One World, said that without a language, there's no self-recognition, there's no traditional knowledge without a language. So we welcome the International Decade so that we can conclude what we haven't managed to conclude over this year. Indigenous languages need clear, well-planned linguistic policy, which is drawn up with the full participation of indigenous peoples and with their consent. Thank you very much, President.
I thank the Indigenous Peoples representative of the Socio-Cultural Region of Eastern Europe, Russian Federation, Central Asia, and Transcaucasia for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, President. A language is a foundation for national identity, practically the only way of preserving and passing on a unique cultural heritage to future generations. In my country, there are 151 languages. And, if you count dialects too, around 300. Preserving all languages, including the rarest which are spoken by indigenous communities, is a key priority in the national government strategy. Certainly, we are not spared from the influence of worldwide trends who significantly increase the risk of languages gradually dying out. Today, indigenous languages are under growing pressure. They're facing new challenges too. Therefore, for Russia, the International Year of Indigenous Languages is of vital significance. On the 29th of November, the President of the Russian Federation chaired a meeting to discuss the outcomes of this International Year in Russia. And a lot was achieved over the year. Our country became the first to set up a national organizational committee for it. In order to draw attention to the topic of indigenous languages, several hundreds of activities and events were held on an international, federal, regional and local level. A law was adopted providing opportunity for education in mother tongues throughout the whole educational process. New education models are being implemented for small and nomadic peoples and small community languages and rare languages. We've created a fund also to preserve and study native languages in Russia, of peoples in Russia. In its first year, the fund focused its work on one of the most important categories, the languages of indigenous peoples of the north, of Siberia and of the Far East. These people carry out traditional activities and preserve the way of life of their ancestors, often in difficult climate circumstances. The task of preserving indigenous languages in Russia, but much like the whole world, requires tireless and long-term work. In this connection, we fully support the International Decade for Indigenous Languages, and we are certain that together the international community will be able to achieve impressive results over the decade. Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the distinguished Deputy Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished Permanent Representative of Argentina. Sir, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. This year has been a great opportunity to accord greater visibility to the importance of indigenous languages as a fundamental part of the culture and identity of our peoples, and to draw attention to the danger of their extinction. In this regard, we wish to underscore the work of UNESCO, of those states which have shared their best practices, and the work of indigenous communities, who were the principal drivers of the actions which have been carried out during the International Year of Indigenous Languages. Our country shares the concern over the current situation suffered by indigenous languages across the world, and we reaffirm our commitment to progressing towards revitalizing, promoting and preserving these languages. As a member of the Group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples, Argentina values the remarkable work done by Mexico as chair of the group and welcomes the resolution of the Third Committee, which will be adopted tomorrow by the General Assembly, and which proclaims 2022 to 2032 as the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. This will allow for greater consolidation and strengthening of the continued inclusion of this topic on the international agenda. We also wish to congratulate Bolivia and Ecuador for their excellent work as facilitators of this resolution. Argentina believes that teaching and promoting indigenous languages is the best means of guaranteeing their intergenerational transmission. However, in our country and our region, this is very challenging. We must take into account those languages which are no longer spoken, languages with few speakers, communities which preserve their indigenous language as a family or community means of communication, and others where Spanish or bilingualism predominate. We must also take into account the great differences between rural and urban contexts and border areas between countries. It's also worth underscoring regional migratory flows, which incorporate speakers of other indigenous languages which are new to our territory. Against this backdrop, international cooperation, exchange of best practices, and strengthening existing mechanisms within regional blocs are fundamental for the revitalization, promotion, and preservation of indigenous languages. Within our region, we all face similar challenges, and we therefore hope that we can reach shared solutions. In this way, new technologies, digital platforms, and other technological resources can play a relevant role by offering teaching and lessons in indigenous languages, particularly in urban contexts, where, given the absence of community, the common use and transmission of a language becomes more difficult. Argentina highlights the unique value of traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and their languages to contribute to addressing the greatest challenges of Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. In this regard, all efforts by international organizations and by states to promote the transmission of indigenous languages to future generations must have a human rights-based focus, and they must inseparably be linked to indigenous communities. It is indigenous peoples who best know the difficulties affecting their languages and who can therefore make substantial contributions to preserve and revitalize these languages so as to achieve the protection and respect of the cultures and identities of all. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Argentina, and I now give the floor to the distinguished Indigenous Peoples representative of the socio-cultural region of Central and South America and the Caribbean, Mr. Elias Kaure. You have the floor, sir.
Nyande nye, nyande iwi. Guirareta inyepe.
The birds, with their twittering, woke me up to come to this assembly. The voices of the children, the happy children, accompanied me on my way. I still smell the smell of our forests burning, the concerns of our earth, and what is happening in this earth bring a lump to my throat. Our ancestors are treading the way for us, and it is our duty to mark the way for future generations. We are the now. We must therefore share the value of our language and its wisdom. We must not be ashamed. We rejoice in this because we still live this and we still speak it. Therefore, with the deepest respect, I speak before you, with a greeting which expresses strength through our differences, with a brotherly and affectionate greeting to the peoples of the world. I apologize. I am going to take on the loaned language of Spanish because my words will reach more people. We are reaching the end of the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and my feelings are mixed. I feel satisfaction for having complied with the responsibility of representing and motivated to know that there are still many Indigenous peoples who love our language and are prepared to fight for it. And I am concerned by a question that I have. Have Indigenous peoples learned the hegemonic languages? They have, but have they learned our languages? The health of Indigenous languages is the responsibility of all, and it is inalienable from our territory. Therefore, revitalising the language and culture of our Indigenous nations must be a global priority. The prevailing system in the world needs Indigenous peoples more than Indigenous people need the system. As Tetara David Guarani said, Indians represent 5% of the global population, but we protect 82% of the world's biodiversity. The world must know this. We do not want to be tenants in our own homes. Our language is our territory and a human right for that reason. I welcome the declaration of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. But standards alone are a dead letter. Therefore, I call upon states to take the declaration seriously, to invest the necessary resources in it. In the same vein, I call upon public and private institutions to support Indigenous languages and ask them to let us be ourselves, and their role can be to accompany us on our way. I welcome the initiative of creating the Ibero-American Indigenous Language Institute. This was boosted by the states of Ibero-America, the FILAC, the OIS, and the SEGIB. Above and beyond the name, in a short time, we will be able to call this Abya Yala, or the Teta Reta Mbae. This is an important action as well, which will allow us to promote public policies to revitalise our languages and cultures in Indigenous nations. Finally, we are living in a time of cyberspace, where virtual reality is now part of our daily life. Language is a central element of this. In this regard, I call upon public and private institutions to support initiatives so as to strengthen technology for all users of each Indigenous language. Allowing a language to perish should be seen as a crime against humanity. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished Indigenous peoples representative of the social-cultural region of Central and South America and the Caribbean for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished Deputy Permanent Representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and the Iran Karapte, that's to everyone, that's hello in Indigenous Ainu language. And I'd like to join our other colleagues in celebrating the 2019 International Year of Indigenous Languages. And I also wish to take this opportunity to express our renewed commitment to the preservation and revitalization of Indigenous languages, as Indigenous languages are, as you know, disappearing at an alarming rate. Madam President, Japan has been leading the promotion of the Sustainable Development Goals, which aims to build a society in which no one will be left behind by 2030, together with the Indigenous peoples. Japan's Indigenous language, the Ainu language, remarkably demonstrates the Ainu people's unique and rich culture, and indeed makes a difference in realizing a diverse and dynamic society, which is a mainstay for sustainable development. Therefore, Japan has made efforts to promote and revitalize the Ainu culture and language. And Madam President, Japan is of the view that enhancing the prestige of the Ainu language and increasing opportunities to use the Ainu language at home are key to handing down the Ainu language and culture to future generations. Aligned with the goal of the year in April, Japan enacted legislation on a comprehensive package of measures to promote and revitalize the Ainu culture and language. Japan has also made effort to expand learning resources available for the Ainu language, including through digitally archived audio data of the language. Japan continues to implement measures for support, access, and promotion of the Ainu language, including educational and awareness-raising programs. Madam President, Japan is now constructing what we call the symbolic space for ethnic harmony in Hokkaido, comprising of a National Ainu Museum and Park as a center for the promotion of the Ainu culture and language. The symbolic space is called upopoi, meaning in singing in a large group in the Ainu language, which will be opened to the public on April 24, 2020, prior to the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games. I wish to invite the distinguished delegates to visit this upopoi and to see and experience the richness and beauty of indigenous peoples' culture and language of Japan. Madam President, Japan is determined to make every effort to achieve the SDGs and to create a society where the inclusion and diversity of all people, including, of course, indigenous peoples, are ensured. We would like to do so by working closely with the Ainu people and civil society, as well as in close collaboration with the international community, including the United Nations and other member states. And I thank you, and Ia Ikem. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished Deputy Permanent Representative of Japan, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
De acuerdo al último censo nacional,
According to the latest census in 2011, only 2.4% of the population of Costa Rica belonged to one of the 8 indigenous peoples and First Peoples. This low percentage of self-identification is not enough to describe or reflect all dimensions of the knowledge, ancestral wisdom, and cultural legacy that characterize still the 8 languages of the Chibcha language. These include Wetar and the 2 Mesoamerican languages, Nahuatl and Curatega. These were the languages used in the area now called Costa Rica. In their forced displacement through colonialism and racism on an institutional basis, some of these languages provided us with languages and expressions. Others still remain very vital and current, such as Kawekar, Bibi, Maliku, and Waimi, or Nebe. Costa Rica is a multi-ethnic and pluricultural country, and it has been so decreed in our recent political constitution. And we know the historic debt we have to our First Peoples, and we recognize the importance, the fundamental importance, of preserving indigenous languages for our social, cultural, environmental development, and alongside this identity and dignity of indigenous peoples. We supported the proclamation of the International Year of Indigenous Languages in 2019 as a landmark in state action in hand with our indigenous communities and peoples. With the invaluable support of UNESCO and the Fund for the Development of Indigenous Peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean, the FELAC, with people cooperating from other international organizations and contributions from governmental organizations and indigenous peoples, including the Presidential Table for Indigenous Affairs and the Indigenous Office, Costa Rica held a national conference on preserving indigenous languages in Costa Rica, with the aim in the medium term of promoting the construction of an action plan and a roadmap to preserve these Costa Rican languages. We have carried out awareness-raising campaigns amongst our people about the need of preserving indigenous languages, and we are carrying out tangible activities in local communities to revitalize them. We're reaching the end of this international year, and we applaud the efforts of UNESCO and other relevant stakeholders from governments, private stakeholders, or from civil society, who have allowed around 900 activities to take place for awareness raising and promotion of indigenous languages across the world. We are also celebrating the proclamation this year of the International Decade for Indigenous Languages from 2022 to 2032. This is a step forward in efforts to revitalize and preserve our indigenous languages. We must seize all the opportunities presented to us by this international decade. Costa Rica is committed to promoting and revitalizing and preserving indigenous languages in line with the provisions of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Convention 169 of the ILO on Indigenous Peoples and Tribes, inter alia, amongst other international human rights instruments. The state most certainly has the obligation of promoting a climate which is favorable to the flourishing of these languages, including through the public education system and ensuring accessibility of public information and services to all those using these languages. However, we cannot but stress the fact that the future of indigenous languages belongs to indigenous peoples, to their inhabitants, their communities. This is why we strongly call for continued demands upon us to ensure that they receive what is theirs by right. I wish to conclude by a passage from a poet, Mainoranes, on a festival amongst the Oruca people in the south of Costa Rica. At the end of every year, says the poet, the Borucas have a great celebration, the Fiesta of the Oblitos. They go up to the top of their mountain. This recalls the arrival of the invader. The warriors dress as they used to do, and they are transformed into powerful animals. They wear masks and costumes for 3 days, he concludes. During these fiestas, they celebrate the return of Quasran, who always comes along in a disguise as a child, white, or an old person. The Borucas receive all people with affection and warmth for this reason, because any visitor might be this Tatica Quasran. They say that one day the whole land will belong to Tatica Quadran, and this will be a land full of fruit, song, and celebration. It will be an eternal, colourful festival. I thank you very much.
The Permanent Representative of Costa Rica for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished Indigenous Peoples Representative of the Social Cultural Region of North America, Mr. Wilton Littlechild. Is Mr. Littlechild here? All right, we'll move on. I now give the floor to the distinguished Permanent Representative of Ireland. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, Excellencies. The rich discussion we're having here this morning on Indigenous languages reminds me certainly of an Irish expression in our own native Gaelic language, which says, Maracurry tu sanarach, ni winnie tu sonor. If you do not sow in the spring, you will not reap in the autumn. What this suggests to me is that in all our work for peace building, sustainable development and reconciliation, we need to design our processes well from the beginning, from the outset, to maximize our chance of success. Far too often, we have adopted a top-down approach which does not adequately take into account the views of local communities, Indigenous peoples, which does not involve them fully in political and planning processes, and which does not respect their cultures. As an Irish representative, central to this issue is the question of language. If Indigenous peoples are to be fully involved in the design of political process, whether they be for development or peace building or indeed reconciliation, it seems to us absurd to suggest that this can be done solely through the medium of languages that are not their own, or in worse cases, through the medium of languages that for many of them have been synonymous with the denial of rights. The history of my own country, Ireland, the forced abandonment of our native Irish language bears testament to that. Madam President, the current rate of loss of Indigenous languages is similar to the crisis we're facing in biodiversity. Those of us who live in metropolitan centres of power often forget or choose to ignore that English is only spoken and indeed understood by 20% of the population of the world. It's also often overlooked that some of the most global international languages are, in peace-building or reconciliation contexts, often heavily associated with the prerogatives and the power of one of the parties to the dispute. We in Ireland believe that respect for the cultural rights of Indigenous groups is an essential prerequisite for the construction of sustainable peace and for the search of durable prosperity and development. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples itself refers to the importance of the UN role in promoting and protecting the rights, and I underline rights, of Indigenous peoples. The UN, as well as other regional organisations, has a responsibility to lead by example and to ensure that political process and the negotiations associated with them are accessible to Indigenous peoples, and to demonstrate in action that lesser used languages have their own place. As an Irish representative, I believe that discussions should take place across our international system, the UN, regional organisations, about how to ensure that core documents and agreements relating to peace and sustainable development are made available to Indigenous language users, and that political participation by Indigenous groups is taken seriously. Article 13.2 of the Declaration places an obligation on states to take effective measures to ensure that Indigenous peoples can understand and be understood in political, legal and administrative proceedings. Surely it's incumbent on all of us to ensure that it's also the case for multilateral or internationally backed process where economic development, peace and security dimensions of Indigenous community lives are often discussed. Failure to do so, I believe, is not only an infringement of the rights of these communities, but is also, unfortunately, unlikely to lead to lasting peace or indeed to sustainable development. As I conclude, Madam President, I wanted to say that in many of our countries, the search for deep reconciliation after protracted conflict and disagreement remains a work in progress. I count my country, Ireland, in that. I believe that respect for the culture of the other that is demonstrated in a practical, tangible way is a key factor in the deeper search for reconciliation. Respect for each other's cultures involves respect for each other's languages. Language as a vehicle of a culture that has been handed down from generation to generation and that is central to our understanding of the world. The French writer Saint-Exupéry wrote, "Stranger, your difference enriches me." It's only when we begin to understand that our differences are a source of wonder and enrichment that we can begin on the path to authentic reconciliation. Gurumila Mahagat Oaktaron. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Ireland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished Indigenous Peoples representative of the Socio-Cultural Region of the Pacific, Ms. Amy Kalili.
Ia oe ka peliki kena na mea hano hano ea pau, me ko umohoa uiwi aloha I kakako mau o lalo, aloha nui kako. He leo aloha puke ia oko e ka lenapi ka uiwi ho ino oko ke kuleana o nei aina. President, member state representatives, and my fellow Indigenous brothers and sisters devoted to perpetuating our Indigenous languages, and everyone gathered here today, greetings to you all. I also extend my special aloha to the Lenape whose lands we are fortunate to gather on today. My name is Amy Kalili and I am a native Hawaiian. I'm a fluent speaker of my Indigenous language, Olalo Hawaii, the Hawaiian language. And I'm able to say and claim that only because of the tireless efforts of generations before me, specifically those who have led the Hawaiian language movement for the past 35 years. Because like many of our families in Hawaii, Olelo Hawaii was not spoken fluently in my family home for 2 to 3 generations before me. From my work in our own Hawaiian language movement to the work that I've been fortunate to do with other Indigenous language efforts nationally and internationally as a director of a global center for Indigenous language excellence based in Hawaii, and also with the steering committee for this international year, I witnessed firsthand how the past 12 months provided a critical platform to highlight some of the great work being done in Indigenous language efforts globally. It's been a time of collaboration, cross-learning, and strategizing on best practices and opportunities that can be replicated by these global language advocates and movements. As we now move towards a decade of Indigenous languages, we do so with the same resolve to ensure that we as Indigenous peoples continue to engage in the processes available to us here at the United Nations to bring forth the valuable knowledge that is codified in our Indigenous languages, knowledge that is critical to us as Indigenous people, but critical to all of us, our peoples and places. As previously referenced, the traction and momentum gained this year must be continued into the decade and even beyond. The onus is on us to take these steps now and do our best to leave the rich legacy that's embodied in the world's Indigenous languages intact for generations to come. Critical issues and strategies that have been discussed at various gatherings held throughout the year, and many that were referenced in previous comments here today, include the continued data gathering and tracking on Indigenous languages themselves, as well as the number of speakers, continued development and sharing of innovative technologies that promote language learning, continued access to and resources for Indigenous peoples to develop and disseminate media in our languages, as well as capacity building mechanisms to train teachers who can teach languages themselves, but who can also teach all content areas through our languages. These are but a few of the ideas and strategies that have come forth this year. We have a saying at home in Hawaii that states, "Ika olalo no keola, ika olalo no ka make," or, "In the language rests life, in the language rests death." This olalo no eau, or traditional Hawaiian saying, drives home the magnitude of the Hawaiian language and its mana, or its force. The power is evidenced on many levels and from many perspectives. We have a strong belief that something can literally be spoken into existence and likewise into failure, such as a person's health or prosperity. Similarly, the language itself has the figurative power to carry and revive a people and their society, as too will the loss of the language just as effectively weaken and destroy a people. I am convinced that there are parallel sayings or understandings in most of our Indigenous languages. One of the greatest benefits of the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and now the decade, is the opportunity for us to come together, learn what our collective global Indigenous lahui, or nation, is doing to address and reverse language loss, and capitalize on this platform to speak to a global community about the continued importance, relevance, and capacity of our Olalo Oiwi, our Indigenous languages. Important, again, not only to us as Indigenous peoples, but to all of us in this global community.
E o mau hoa o iwi a ohe hana nui ke alu ia. Ano leila, e ho'o mau vivo ole aku no kako ma ke ano a ma ke ala I ho'o moe ia I mamualoa e ko kako mau kupuna. To my Indigenous colleagues, no task is too hard when pursued together, and so let us continue on courageously in the manner of and along the path laid for us by our ancestors. Mahalo.
I thank the distinguished Indigenous peoples representative of the socio-cultural region of the Pacific, and I now give the floor to Mr. Khalid Shukri, Secretary General of the European Language Resources Association and member of the open-ended drafting group of the strategic outcome document of the International Year of Indigenous Languages. Mr. Shukri.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to take part to today's meeting on Indigenous languages and introduce how my field of expertise, the language technologies, can support the promotion and revitalization of Indigenous languages. In today's world, digital literacy, access to knowledge, and quality content, in particular in local languages, are prerequisite for the fulfillment of our human rights and fundamental freedoms. Despite the policies implemented and the technological progress achieved, many language users, particularly Indigenous peoples, still experience barriers to access information online. At school, in the workplace, and in everyday life, they encounter obstacles in using smartphones, computers, applications, and other tools in their own languages. These difficulties are compounded by gender, disability, linguistic, economic, socio-political, and digital divide. In this context, language technologies can greatly contribute to the promotion of linguistic diversity and multilingualism in the digital world. These technologies are moving outside research laboratories into numerous applications in many different areas. Language technology development, in particular in the new breakthroughs brought by artificial intelligence, include keyboard technologies, spelling and grammar checkers, speech dictation and interaction, machine translation, automatic interpretation for text and audio data, but also for sign languages, speech synthesis, and spoken dialogue. So one can imagine a very interesting, friendly conversation between a Guarani and the Sami speakers mediated by a computer equipped with machine translation. However, a small number, less than 100, of the over 7,000 languages spoken around the world have associated language technologies today, and with various levels of quality. The majority of languages can be referred to as under-resourced or as not supported. This situation puts the users of many languages, vast majority of Indigenous languages, in a disadvantageous situation, creating a digital divide and placing their languages in danger of digital extinction when not simply extension. My community of technologists has set a concrete objective, a long-lasting commitment for all stakeholders for the development of new language technologies as an effective and necessary means for promoting a multilingual society for the benefit of all communities, in particular Indigenous ones. Indigenous communities should have the capability to define their own needs, expectations, and requirements through an international shared research agenda with a clear roadmap for all languages that incorporate necessarily ethical consideration. I hence advocate for and support the decade of a strong partnership on this new development under the umbrella of UNESCO. Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Mr. Shukri for his statement. We have heard the last speaker for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers for the plenary segment this afternoon at 3 p.m. in this hall. The meeting is adjourned.